why don't we going to be next to me? Why don't we be somewhat equidistant? Look sort of so we can go this way a little bit more. Keep going. Perfect. Good afternoon. My name is Markenzie LaPointe. I am the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Thank you for joining us here today to announce a federal law enforcement operation that directly impacts our South Florida community. But before we make our announcements, please allow me to take a moment to address what I know is heavily on the hearts and minds of everyone here today and the public at large. As President Biden powerfully shared during his recent remarks this past weekend, pure, unadulterated evil was unleashed on this world. The bloody hands of the terrorist organization Hamas carried out an egregious act of terrorism against the people of Israel. The crimes are abhorrent. There is no justification for terrorism. We as Americans have suffered as victims ourselves in the most colossal way. There is no place for hate or evil acts, not against Jews, Muslims, or anyone else around the globe, and certainly in our community. We grieve for those who are suffering unspeakable losses. As law enforcement partners, we stand united against hatred, violent extremism, and acts of terrorism. And we stand ready to address any threat that anyone may feel motivated to act upon over the next few days, weeks, and months. Alongside me today is Federal Reserve Board Office of Inspector General Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Miami Regional Office, Wayne Rosen, and Broward Sheriff Gregory Tony. And along the lines, you'll see folks from my office, from the management office, the Fort Lauderdale office, financial crime section, and the prosecutors who actually brought this case, who spent many months working on this case. Together with the officials standing alongside of me, we are here today to announce federal charges against 17 defendants. Each defendant is charged separately, yielding a total of 17 separate cases or prosecutions. This is not a single indictment involving 17 defendants. Rather, it is 17 separate indictments. As announced in open court earlier today, during the times of the offenses charged, all 17 defendants were employed as sworn officers with the Broward Sheriff's Office. The charges in all these cases spring from schemes to defraud COVID financial relief programs. Over the next few minutes, I'll be sharing some brief remarks. Thereafter, I'll be followed by Assistant Special Agent in charge Rosen and Sheriff Tony, who I am very grateful to for agreeing to host us here when I asked him. I truly appreciate that. Yes, sir. Once we all have completed our remarks, we'll take a few questions. Now, as I believe most of us are familiar with, over 3.5 years ago, the United States Congress enacted what is commonly known as the CARES Act as a means of providing relief to millions of people suffering significant economic impact from the COVID pandemic. One important program was the Paycheck Protection Program, which is also known by the acronym PPP. The PPP authorized forgivable loans to small businesses for expenses including job retention. Another important program was the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, which is also known by the acronym EIDL, E-I-D-L. The EIDL authorized the extension of loans to small businesses experiencing a shortfall in revenue due to the pandemic at the time. Funds available under these programs were designed to keep small businesses afloat, to allow businesses to provide goods and services to their communities by assisting them in funding business costs, including payroll and group health care benefits. These programs, in turn, assisted employees in supporting themselves and their families in the middle of a crisis. Of course, the proceeds of the loans were not to be used to purchase consumer goods, automobiles, personal residences, clothing, jewelry, or for cosmetic surgery. These programs provided a valuable source of economic support to countless Americans. Unfortunately, as often occurs, they also have proven to be ready targets for defendants or offenders looking to profit from fraud. The prosecution of COVID financial fraud offenses has been and continues to be an important priority of federal law enforcement, including in this district. Since the enactment of the CARES Act, the United States Attorney's Office has charged more than 150 cases involving in excess of about $195 million in losses. This is not an abstract crime. It has real consequences, not only to our economy, but also to our federal coffers. Now, you may have heard that the wheels of justice turn slowly, but turn they do. And when individuals take advantage of government programs intended to provide relief to people in need by fraudulently applying and receiving funds from those programs, the federal government will come after you. Whether it be in a year, 2 years, or 5 years, there is a reckoning. The 17 criminal cases announced today mark another significant set of prosecutions in our efforts to combat COVID financial fraud. On May 17, 2021, the Attorney General established COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement Task Force that is to marshal the resources of the Department of Justice in partnership with agencies across government to enhance efforts to combat and prevent pandemic-related fraud. Now, later on in 2022, the Attorney General selected this district, the Southern District of Florida, to head a national COVID-19 fraud strike force team to enhance existing efforts to fight and prevent COVID-19 related financial fraud. This is a priority for the Department of Justice and for the President. The strike force combines law enforcement and prosecutorial resources to focus on pandemic relief fraud, to include, as occurred here, multiple instances of fraud being carried by employees of the same organization. This is not unique to BSO in and of itself. As I noted earlier, during the times of the offenses charged, all 17 defendants were employed as sworn BSO deputies. All 17 defendants are charged with participating in various schemes to defraud the United States Small Business Administration by providing false information regarding their eligibility for financial assistance through the PPP and EIDL programs, and then diverting the funds for their own personal uses. The charging documents allege that these 17 defendants collectively receive approximately $500,000 through those offenses. While the charging documents do not allege that any of the defendants committed the charged offenses in the course of their official duties, this does not in any way diminish the seriousness of what the defendants are alleged to have done here. Law enforcement officers stand in a position of trust to the members of the public who they serve. An officer who engages in criminal activity, whether it occurs on duty or off duty, undermines this very trust. In instances like this, our office and our law enforcement partners necessarily must seek to hold them accountable, which is what we're doing today, which is what those indictments establish today. I want to thank you first for your attention to this important matter. I commend our law enforcement partners and the prosecutors who've actually worked on this case. I show up here and actually have a press conference with you, but there are prosecutors who spent countless hours, countless months to do this. I also want to thank the sheriff, who also has been what I can only define as super collaborative in ensuring that this investigation proceeded in an appropriate manner. For now, I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton to Special Agent in Charge Rosen, after which Sheriff Tony will have something to say. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wayne Rosen, and I'm the Assistant Special Agent in Charge for the Miami Regional Office of the Office of Inspector General for the Federal Reserve Board and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Our mission is to combat fraud, waste, and abuse relating to the programs and operations of the Federal Reserve Board and the CFPB. To help people and businesses suffering from the economic fallout caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, The CARES Act was enacted to provide emergency financial assistance. The Federal Reserve also ensured that credit kept flowing through the financial system to households and businesses through the emergency lending facilities such as the Paycheck Protection Program Liquidity Facility. Unfortunately, bad actors have targeted this assistance to commit fraud for their personal gain and at the expense of those truly in need. Today's announcement demonstrates our unwavering commitment to holding accountable those who exploit and defraud financial institutions and the government's pandemic response, no matter who they are. I want to commend and thank our agents, the Broward Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for their efforts and their dedication to the pursuit of justice. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Sheriff Tony.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I want to just kind of echo the sentiments of our colleagues here from the U.S. Attorney's Office and all our different federal groups who have been absolutely impeccable in terms of their response when we started to discover what was occurring here in this organization. This is more so for a message for my community. Over the last 5 years, I continue to echo the importance of having an organization that will be handled under the operations of transparency and ensuring that we would be accountable to make sure we can police ourselves. And the things that we've initiated over the last 5 years have proven fruitful today as this indictment takes place. We created our Office of Inspector General to work with our Public Corruption Unit to do precisely this, to discover and track down any wrongdoings in hopes to avoid these things being exacerbated and turn into worse type of situations. And this investigation really went back almost about 2021 when we started examining and witnessing what was occurring. And under my orders, I authorized our Public Corruption Unit to investigate all 5,500 employees under this matter to ensure that we were not going to leave one stone unturned and provide an opportunity for an employee, in this particular case, an employee who's wearing a badge and has taken an oath to violate that oath and create embarrassment for this organization and for this profession. And I was delighted in giving kudos to our men and women from our organization to bring this up to the level to where we can put something solid and concrete into our federal partners' hands and then walk back and allow them to do what they do best, which is conduct a thorough investigation that's impartial, unbiased, and handled on the highest levels of professionalism. Lastly, to my people in this organization, we have worked too hard to allow us to become sloppy and to have one or two individuals to tarnish our reputation. We have done a great job within this community to reestablish the public trust over the last 5 years. And so I'm empowering our employees. If you see something, I expect you to say something. I expect you to bring us more information if there's any other type of misconduct or corruption occurring from any colleague in this place. But keep in mind, there's almost 6,000 employees in here, and as the U.S. Attorney talked about in terms of how this type of criminality has been occurring across the country, you can anticipate that we would have a group of employees who would have taken advantage of this. Ultimately, the end of this investigation does have zero bearings on my administrative responsibility to hold the men and women accountable. And if you've paid attention over the last 5 years, you witnessed me terminate over 65 employees across every single discipline. And so the outcome will be the same. Again, I thank our federal partners for taking the time out and making so many different concessions and accommodations for us as an organization and doing an impeccable job to help us retain our reputation. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Of course. Appreciate that. We have time for a few questions if you folks have any.
I would think that when something like this
Start,
happens,
Ted, then we'll go this way. Sure.
when something like this happens, I mean, that's got to be some personal feel for you. Can you talk about the disappointment, perhaps?
It's very disappointing in the fact that I've witnessed so many different changes, Ted, over the last few years and a lot of successes. We've been very clear in terms of administration what our focal point on is in terms of accountability. We've put forth a go-by in terms of our employees and staff have seen that there's a zero tolerance element. And I hate to see that, knowing some of the individuals and seeing the names on that list that's being indicted, some of them were good officers. But you're only as good as the last act and conduct that you execute. And so if you're going to be participating in criminal activities, we don't want you in this profession because you're not going to ruin the other almost 6,000 people's reputation here and the hundreds of thousands of first responders and law enforcement officers who are doing this job every day.
Sheriff, all 17, I assume, have been suspended. Have any others been suspended as the investigation continues, and is there a larger group that you're looking at?
What I would be able to answer for you from our side is when we first start diving into this investigation from our side and examine the amount of members who had either applied or so for this PPP aspect, we initially narrowed down to about 100 employees. That's not to state that 100 employees are being indicted, but we wanted to analyze and put something in front of our federal partners that they can process, diagnose, and see who's related to the criminal patterns, and this is what they presented so far.
So it's just 17?
As of today.
And no discipline against anybody else under suspicion
Or
suspension?
Well, to answer that question, in terms of discipline, we still have to follow protocols in the sense of these are protected members with union rights and other different statutory obligations from investigation practices that we have to follow. But I'm not going to sugarcoat or dance around this. At the end of the day, they will be gone. If they're being criminally charged, there's no place for this in this organization. Now, their due process components will be executed. We will go through that process, but this one here is a no-brainer. How could we have anyone out here wearing a badge that is stealing from the American people? And by the way, Broward County is an American. It's an American society, right? This is part of our country. So we're stealing from ourselves. Going back to Ted's question, yeah, it's frustrating, but it's not going to happen again. Any other questions for me? Yes, sir.
Yes. How many, I've heard that some people have been asked to resign. Is that true?
We have not asked anyone to resign.
Hasn't.
I have not asked anyone to resign. Let me tell you how this is going to work out. Our federal partners at the lead, they're going to handle their investigations from the criminal component, but from an administrative standpoint, in-house, we're going to do it by the book. If individuals elect to present themselves or turn themselves in or resign, that's fine, but that does not mitigate the obligation we have as an administration to hold these individuals accountable. Yes, ma'am, and then I see you, Roy. I'll come. Yes. It's been a cross-section of, and I will go through it really quickly with you. It is a cross-section of multiple disciplines within the organization, as the U.S. Attorney stated. From what we can account for right now, and if I'm off, Mr. Attorney, please correct me, but we have 7 members from the Department of Law Enforcement, 1 including the Department of Law Enforcement sergeant, 8 Department of Detention deputies, and 1 sergeant also from the Department of Defense, Department of Detention as well. And then, Roy, you had a question for me. Yes, sir.
So as of right now, they're going to be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, is that correct?
That is correct. That's standard protocol.
And all 5,500 employees were investigated. Did any of these employees of the 17, did they have legitimate businesses?
Without diving into the criminal investigation, once I stated, when this got to a point where we saw that this needed to fall within the structure in the hands of the federal government, we turned it over. But going back to that 5,500 employees, that included myself and every single senior ranking administrator in this house. So nobody was excluded from this. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is probably a federal question, but was there a ringleader, somebody at the center who was providing these services to the various...
I could answer that question, but I think it's more preferable that the U.S. Attorney answer that because he...
17 different cases. So, usually we have a conspiracy, a nexus that has everybody joined in together. That's usually how you make your cases. This is 17 separate indictments, highly unusual. So what's going on?
Jay has a criminal mind, obviously, so he goes straight to the he goes straight to the core of it. Well, so I think that's a natural question. How do you have so many individuals committing the same crime within the very same proximity, the same place? I can only speak to our investigation. Our investigation revealed that there was not a conspiratorial component to this, which is sort of unusual, right? I mean, if you have, as a general rule, when you have a situation where you have multiple defendants and multiple offenders committing a crime, there is usually a link. In some ways, when I was first discussing this case and I was looking at the sheer number, Jay, my first reaction was, well, there must have been some sort of conspiracy. It just sort of makes sense. It's almost like if you're in the middle of the desert and then there's, a 10 sort of explosion that happened at the same time, you sort of have to say, well, there is coordination. We have not been able to find that coordination. Having said that, though, Jay, it is still an interesting phenomenon that you would have that many folks doing this in the same place. This reflects, nonetheless, not necessarily something in particular about BSO, but it reflects perhaps the notion that when you have a federal program that's being offered to provide relief to a large number of people, you always going to have opportunistic individuals who are going to try to take advantage of it. As you know, this is not unique to the PPP program or the EIDL program. That is consistent across violations and across disciplines, where you have folks who basically say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of this. And our job is, as law enforcement, is to make sure that we actually hold these folks accountable.
So as a follow-up, was it more of a word-of-mouth issue, or one employee kind of whispers to another, you heard about this PPP loan program, might be a quick way to make a fast buck?
Right. I think you're hitting on sort of the underpinning of how these things work, right? It became very clear with respect to the CARES Act, with respect to the PPP and the EIDL program. It became very clear that this was a way, if you wanted to get some money, you could. If you wanted to get some money, and part of the problem is when we had the pandemic, the country was facing with the real and concrete possibility of an economic crash. And at the time, I think we can be honest about this, perhaps the guardrails normally that would be necessary to ensure there's a check and balance as to how these things work. I don't necessarily know that policymakers necessarily cared about that. People cared about getting the money into the economy, getting the money into those communities. That was the most important thing, because at that time, the concern is, let's get the money out there, let's get the small business to get the money. And clearly there's an honor system in some ways that was perhaps relied upon. But frankly, there's a risk, I think there's a risk benefit analysis that's made when it comes to whether or not you let an economy crash, all right, or you wait until you have all the guardrails that you can have to ensure that the people who are actually getting the money, right, in fact, are entitled to that money. Of course, across the board, you're always going to have fraudsters. I mean, we live in a hurricane, we live in this town here. We know how that goes when it's hurricane season, when we have to fix things, when we have to provide money for all those things. This is not, we're no stranger to that. So in that sense, I would say, Jay, I understand sort of the depth of your inquiry, but it doesn't require that sort of conspiracy, sort of the core conspiracy players in this case. It's just a matter of people seeing an opportunity to make money. That doesn't mean there aren't people who weren't talking about it, right? That doesn't mean that somebody who works in, I don't know, in IT is saying, hey, I get the, hey, you can get $20,000, right? And that person says, here, there's a guy right here, we can fill that out for you and you get it in the next week. So, beyond that, I don't know what I can provide in terms of that. I think so. There's, sir?
Are there any more active investigations?
That's always a difficult thing when you ask a prosecutor whether or not there is active investigation.
Will more indictments follow?
Well, as the sheriff, and I'm going to take his word on this, as he has provided in the last minute, clearly this went beyond 17 individuals, right? There was a critical mass of individuals that were engaging in this fraud. What we can tell you is the investigation is ongoing. And those prosecutors you see behind me, they are continuing to work. I don't think they are going on vacation as it relates to these investigations in these cases. So that's as much as I can tell you right now. But keep in mind, you can put two and two together. The indictments, we certainly couldn't come in as a structural matter for the courts and for us. When you have to indict that many defendants on individual indictments, it's a very difficult thing, right? As a sort of dollars and cents thing, it's very hard to do, which is why sometimes it's good to have in a conspiracy count. When you have numerous defendants, you can put in a conspiracy count. That's different. We have to charge every single defendant on its own, her own indictment, and you're trying to show up here and put 50 indictments in one day. I don't know if some of you were in the courthouse today, but I imagine you saw how that process went, and that was just for 17 defendants, right?
Can we clarify that? You said 100, of your employees, 100 had applied for or received a loan. 17 have been indicted. No others have been suspended, pending investigation, but I thought you just said that this went beyond the 17 individuals. How far beyond, and who are we talking about? Why aren't they suspended?
Sure. Keeping in context, from BSO's perspective, when we launched at my request to analyze all 5,500 employees, one of the first things that was discovered that there was an applicant pool or so of individuals, about 100, that did apply to the PPP program. As that started getting dissected and analyzed, we realized it's time for us to step apart and step out of it and turn it over to our federal partners so that if they deemed all 100 needed to be indicted, we didn't have any control over that. And I didn't want control over that. This is an important relationship that we have with our federal partners, especially when we're talking about a criminal investigation to this magnitude, that they need to run this show. We need to, from my positioning is, and my directive to my team is, the federal government, the U.S. Attorney, has full access to this organization unobstructed. So if he decides that he needs to come back and his team and do more evaluations and follow-ups, and that leads to more indictments and more arrests, it's going to lead to more terminations from BSO standpoint.
But not all 100 were fraudulent.
That's correct, from what we've been able to establish right now.
What number is fraudulent, and what action have you taken against more than 17?
Yeah, I think that still goes back over to the federal jurisdiction to be able to state where they are.
You still have them on the payroll.
Excuse, I still have them on the payroll.
If there's more than 17 and you haven't suspended anyone else, then
Can't suspend people without some form of official misconduct. So in order for us to start suspending people and staying in compliance with these, from this case, they're law enforcement officers, right? So they have the Bill of Rights and all these other protection measures. I can't just start blanketly suspending people just because they applied for a loan. It's not illegal until we find criminal patterns for it. So we suspend and we will operate in terms of suspending employees depending upon what our federal partners discover, communicate with us, and then that gives me the authority to be in compliance to suspend and later terminate. Does that make sense? One more.
Let me just address this point. I think that's a relevant point, and that is, what do you do as if you know, in fact, there are individuals who, in fact, you knew that it was more than the 17, what do you do with the rest? If it provides some clarity to you, in our investigation, and I can speak to this, we at least found one person who was part of that batch initially, who on the surface may have appeared to have actually been committing PPP fraud. But upon our investigation, a determination was made that this was in fact a legitimate business. And that person at the end of the day, you know, we were not going to prosecute that person. We were not going to proceed. And why that is important is, look, there is always a demand for efficiency. There is always a demand for promptness in prosecution. But prosecution is not perfect, and it requires people to be careful about how you actually bring these things. How do you address those things? Now, I want you to imagine for a moment, had we done a blanket type of sort of thing where we basically indicted everyone that was brought up to us with respect to those who had actually submitted the paperwork, and some of the paperwork on their face appeared to have been fraudulent, that particular target would have been indicted, would have had a complaint dropped on her or him, right? And at the end, on the back end, to me, that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy as well in sort of the rush to make sure that we catch every bad fish. We end up catching a fish that is not so bad, who happens to have met the group characteristics in this particular case. So on my end, it is extremely important for me, right, that when we bring prosecution, when we investigate people, that we do not overreact. We do not simply drop indictment based on speculation and based on what the papers may appear to show. It matters because, frankly, once you go in and you submit a search warrant for someone, you go into their house, you go into their computers, you can't reverse the harm you've done to that individual. Once you've dropped an indictment, no matter what happened, post-dismissal, you cannot reverse that. So those concerns and those interests matter to me a great deal, separate and apart from the sheriff's administrative concerns, which I'm happy I don't have to actually be part of.
Sheriff, can you explain to us why you decided to even embark on this investigation? What was the spark that said we're going to start looking at?
Well, I can tell you, going back, it was right around November of 2021, where we were focusing on an employee who had committed some policy violations and misconduct and was subject to an internal affairs investigation. Had nothing to do with the PPP element. But in that investigation, like most investigations, we start developing other leads and more intel. And the intel that we were able to gather from that individual is that, hey, there may be some more PPP fraudulent elements that's taking place here. And for me, whether it be one or all 5,500, I'm subject for maintaining and holding this organization accountable to the public. So why would I just randomly sample? Could have done that. The thoroughest way to get to identifying the problem, in my opinion and the collective opinions of my commanders, was that let's take a snapshot look at every single employee, identify those who at least applied to it and had been a recipient of those proceeds, and then start narrowing it down. And as I said before, once we got to a point where, hey, there's some criminal conduct here, it's time for our federal partners to take over.
Now, Mr. LaPointe, you stated some of the things they spent their money on. Was that this group, cosmetic surgery, homes, or was that just a vague statement?
I don't want you to take that. What we have found, I'm not referring to this group, what we have found with respect to PPP fraudsters, not just this, PPP fraudsters, you know, as is the case for most frauds, right? The fraudsters take the money and they use it for personal use. It just so happens the examples I gave you are some of the examples we've found in multiple investigations and prosecutions. It just so happens a lot of the people who commit this fraud, given where we are with respect to social media, they also post some of the things that they've acquired, some of the assets they've acquired subsequent to the fraud with the proceeds of the fraud, and those are some of the examples we've had in terms of cars, houses, and cosmetic surgery, and that sort of thing. Not necessarily here, but keep in mind some of the amounts in this particular case. So we've had cases where we've prosecuted organizations, right, that were manufacturing sort of PPP, sort of like they were PPP fraud mills, if you will, and those involve millions of dollars, right? So that's a whole different set of things in terms of what's going on there, right? But so there's all types of things that result from that.
Are you able to tell us a few of the things that they did spend it on?
No, at this point. So keep in mind, I mean, the stage of a prosecution, there are different stages. There's the complaint or indictment, and there is sentencing. At some point, when people realize, all right, you know, to kind of have a come to Jesus moment, they tend to tell you, yes, we purchased this, but that's the stage. A lot of times, that's in the plea negotiation stage sometimes, or pre-sentence stage sometimes. So we have a huge history, kind of a bank, if you will, of some of these things. And as it relates to this, we don't know. The amounts were, I mean, think about it. Let me give you one example. There's one example, one of the defendants here, it was a basketball, children basketball, whatever, as a sole proprietorship, right? A person says, okay, this is our business. We've had revenue of $100,000, and we submit our paperwork through the SBA process, and that person gets $22,000 or thereabouts, the maximum. That's really sort of the standard, you know, for sort of this batch here. People will basically claim to have, so the standard fraud is as follows. You come in and you say, I have a business. I had this business for before the pandemic, because the pandemic requires a certain timeline. You have to have had a business by February 2020, I believe, and you have to have payroll. And the fraud is not that hard, right? You can open up an LLC somewhere, and you submit some sort of fraudulent paperwork, right? And keep in mind, at the time, the people receiving the paperwork, they're not checking, you know, at the time. Then you get your money. By the way, you submit your loan application to a bank. You're not submitting it to the SBA. You're not submitting it to some other organization. The bank gives the money. The money is guaranteed by the SBA. The bank was going to get its money one way or the other, right? So that's the general scheme. And the scheme usually means sort of, okay, I have revenue of X. I've been in business at Y time, which is generally a lie. That's not the case. Or I have payroll of X. I've had payroll expenses of Y. I have health care benefits expended of X. That's the standard, and they make these representations, these forms. Fortunately for us, all those forms are submitted and are in fact in bank at the SBA, electronic system, we're able to actually track that once we investigate it and be able to confront those defendants at a certain time. Just one thing sort of to understand with respect to the PPP fraud that we've been dealing with. Obviously, we're dealing with sort of BSO employees in this case. PPP has become sort of the gift that keeps on giving, right, as it relates to fraud. So when you think of sort of white-collar fraud in terms of paper fraud, this is sort of like bread and butter for it. But what we've learned over the last number of years, there have been a number of outfits, for instance, violent crime outfits, who realize, well, they too can do PPP loans, right? So you have gang who ordinarily used to do the sort of home invasion robberies, who used to do that sort of thing. And they still do that. But, the return on a home invasion robbery involves a certain amount of risk, right? Whereas PPP fraud, you sit in some basement somewhere, right? So those guys, they have actually been able to actually defraud the government for millions of dollars as well. This is just to give you kind of a context in terms of sort of the widespread nature of this and how it has impacted our society.
Did you find that the employees were using BSO equipment?
Okay. So we'll go right to you after that. Go ahead, please.
Did you find out that BSO employees were actually using the BSO laptops that they're issued to apply for these loans? Or was that part of the investigation, or was it all just personal?
I do not have that information, but one of the things, a related question, I think, would be whether or not they were using their official capacity, in order to actually get this loan. Because a lot of these crimes, a lot of times when it involves public officials, involve the use of your official capacity. We did not find that, right? You didn't need to do that in this case because it's such an easy scheme, right? Sir, please.
A lot of the early cases that the strike force did were for many millions of dollars.
Right.
This one, you said, is a total of 500,000.
For those, right.
Right. Which suggests that you're focusing on law enforcement. Are there other police agencies that you're focusing on?
Right.
So,
sure. Let me tell you. Obviously, if we listen, these guys are very busy. All right. We probably could put 2 more prosecutors on these investigations in terms of the scale of the fraud. What I can tell you is that we're committed to proceed and basically chase out those frauds and find out who they are and prosecute them. As it relates to targeting, we were not targeting any particular institution, but by virtue of the nature of the fraud, you know this very well, it has been so endemic in some ways that it has touched a lot of organizations and institutions. So it wouldn't be surprising that others are engaged in that fraud as well.
but with this, it seems like there's more cops than anybody else.
With respect to this investigation,
Well,
to this,
today and what's happened earlier this year, Miami-Dade cops and INS guy and some other.
I don't know the exact number, to be frank with you, but there's been a lot of folks, official and non-official.
But can you say explicitly yes or no, are you focusing on law enforcement agencies?
No, I'm not going to say that because we're focusing on whoever is violating the crime, who's violating the statute, whoever is taking advantage of the program. If it happens to be a police officer, so be it. If it happens to be a school teacher, so be it. If it happens to be a guy who runs an investment shop in Las Olas, who makes $1 million a year, and he decided he was going to get, $300,000 worth of PPP, we're going to go after the guy. I don't think we're focusing in the way that you're saying.
Mark, if I could just
Please.
expand on kind of your question here, and something I think that's pivotal, and this isn't the federal government's responsibility. This is the responsibility of administrators and law enforcement. Everyone knows there's trillions of dollars that's been stolen, and the larger your organization is, several thousand, 10,000, 40,000, NYP, et cetera, as examples, the administrations, if they take an aggressive response about accountability and start diving into their organizations, I guarantee you that they're going to find more employees engaged in this. This is why it's important, or it was important to your question, for us to look at everybody, to look through the whole 5,500.
That other heads of agencies should do what you did?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no mystery. We're seeing this stuff pop up in small scales across the country, and we're getting firefighters involved, we're getting police officers, we're getting nurses and everything. If you're an administrator, especially over a public safety organization, you have an obligation to the community that you're serving to at least look at this. Going back to my earlier statement, this is theft from the American people. There's 2 million people in this county. These employees stole from those 2 million people as far as I'm concerned. And I guarantee you, if there's a more aggressive and assertive level of accountability across this country, our federal partners are going to be executing more cases.
Well, thank you very much, folks. I really appreciate you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.